Hi, welcome to this Accofina tutorial. This is a quick economics tutorial. We're going to talk about what are central banks and what are their tasks and objectives. Okay, so an introduction to central banks. Now, central banks are banks and monetary authorities for national governments and nations. So while most private banks service individuals or corporations, central banks are meant for governments and nations. Now, they're set up and managed by specific legislation. So while other organisations may be set up under an umbrella piece of legislation, central banks generally have their own specific legislation. And for example, the Bank of England Act of 1988, which isn't the first Bank of England Act, it's only the most recent. There's the Federal Reserve Act, which set up the Federal Reserve System in America, the Reserve Bank of India Act in 1934, and also in Australia, the Reserve Bank Act of 1959. Central banks can be privately held or owned by governments, and I believe that owned by governments is the more standard practice. However, the Federal Reserve banks, the Federal Reserve System in the US, are privately held. They're actually owned by their member banks. And an example of the other side is the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is wholly owned by the Australian government. Now, while they are owned and influenced by government, or many of them are, it's important to know that they're independent of government. They're not their own government department, they're not an arm of the current administration, they're meant to be completely separate and act independently of government. Next up, they're overseen by a governor or chairperson with an accompanying board. So many of us know the governor or chairperson of our own nation's central bank, and the board and the governor or chairperson will run the central bank. And finally, it's worth noting that many central banks were modelled on the Bank of England. Now, while the Bank of England wasn't the first central bank, it was set up very early, 1694, and I think the influence of the English Empire and their financial system meant that many central banks were structured similarly to how the Bank of England was set up. Okay, so what do central banks do? What are the tasks that they carry out? Well, one of the most obvious ones, or one we come across every day, is they issue currency. So if you look at your banknotes in your wallet, then you may see that they've been issued by your central bank. Secondly, they store and manage the gold and foreign currency reserves. So for economic policy or for government reasons, there might be gold stores or holdings of foreign currency. It's the responsibility of the central bank to take care of that and manage it. Thirdly, central banks offer banking services to governments and other banks. So you might find if you're issued by a payment by your government, such as you're issued a stimulus check. I remember back in 2009 in Australia, the checks will be issued from the particular central bank of your country. As for services to other banks, central banks can often offer short-term lending to private banks to assist their daily liquidity needs. Fourthly, you might find that central banks regulate banking or the payment systems in the country and can sometimes be a lender of last resort. So for example, there's the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is the Singaporean central bank, that oversees the entire banking system and financial system in Singapore. As for payment systems, there's the Payment System Board of the RBA, which manages the payment system in Australia. And you may remember the Federal Reserve System assisted private banks during the GFC in America as a lender of last resort. And while this isn't one of their official duties, you will find that many central banks carry out and publish research and statistical data on economic and financial matters. So they do a lot of work in regards to studying the economy and provide that information to the public. They're seen as a reputable and reliable source for economic and financial data. And some examples here is the Fed's Beige Book and also the Bank of England's Monetary and Credit Statistics. And the Fed's Beige Book, if I remember correctly, is a commentary on the economic conditions of America. And finally, what people most often know central banks for is they conduct monetary policy. And that's probably the most famous task carried out by most central banks. Now, what are the objectives of central banks? All central banks aim to control inflation. And this is tied back to that monetary policy task that's carried out. But you'll find that all banks try to control inflation. They try to target price stability. But what you'll also find is that some central banks have other objectives. Now this may be individual to the particular country or central bank, but you might find banks tasked at aiming maintaining full employment, such as recently the Federal Reserve Bank in America has been watching employment statistics. I'm not sure if it's one of their official objectives, but they're keeping a strong eye on employment numbers. You may find that central banks try and stabilize and smooth exchange rate movements and sometimes even target them. So while they might have a freely floating exchange rate policy, a particular country, you might find that central banks do get involved in currency markets and try and influence their nation's exchange rates. And a more general one is that central banks might be tasked with promoting economic growth, prosperity and welfare of the community. You'll find that the Australian Central Bank, the RBA, does have the welfare of the community or the welfare of Australians in its objectives. And finally, what's the overall status of central banks? Why does so much of the population find them alluring or important to pay attention to? This is because they're powerful institutions that influence markets, the economy, and even foreign economies. What they do can influence our investments, our jobs, even our governments, and in the case of foreign economies, you'll often find that some of the larger countries and their central banks, such as the UK or the US or Japan, when their central banks move, it's hard for smaller economies to ignore what the foreign central banks are doing. So they can influence smaller foreign economies. You find that central banks are managed and run by highly educated and experienced experts. The people that run central banks are considered to be leaders in the fields of economics and finance. They're considered to be the top of their game, the brightest of the bright, the smartest of the smart, and are thus highly admired by many. You may remember Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve. There was a lot of hero worship when it came to Alan Greenspan for many years. He was considered to be one of the smartest people in the world, the master of the universe, and that's what builds the reputation behind them. Now, they attract a great deal of attention from the media and the financial community. Because of their power and influence, you'll find that many people want to know what are they thinking? What's their outlook on the economy? What about the markets? Their statements are highly scrutinized. They have to be very careful what they say because of the influence they do have and the amount of attention they are getting. What you'll find when central bank employees or leaders give statements to the community or groupings, that they're very careful with their words. They make sure that they're very deliberate in what they say and not too loose with big statements that could go shooting off left and right because they know how highly scrutinized their statements are. And what you'll find is that their independence from government, as mentioned earlier, can often have them at odds with politicians and administrators, who, as you know, are other high-powered individuals and institutions. And this fact can just compound the above factors I just mentioned. Now, it's important to note that while they can be at odds with politicians and administrators, they're very careful about getting into arguments or overall contradicting the politicians and administrators. They kind of use central bank speak and central bank language to sometimes disagree or not wholeheartedly agree with perhaps the government in power. And you'll often also find that politicians and administrations don't often agree with what their central banks are doing, and they can actually be quite confrontational in regards to it. And that just kind of builds the overall reputation that central banks hold. Okay, conclusion and wrap up. What did we cover today? We did an introduction to central banks. We looked at the tasks carried out by central banks. We looked at the objectives of central banks, and then the overall status and reputation of central banks. Okay, that's it. I hope it helped. Best of success. There are your congratulatory fireworks for getting to the end of the video. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel. Click on the button that'll soon appear. Watch another one of my tutorials now, or even just give me a thumbs up. Or if you didn't like it, you can of course give me a thumbs down. Finally, feel free to comment below if anything needs clarification, or if you just want to say hello. Thank you very much for your time.